The question: how might we decolonize a sector that was specifically designed for the purpose of continuing colonialism? Let's find out. So, if you didn't already know, the international development sector was developed as a way to repackage old forms of colonialism that were considered to be no longer viable by the West. So to briefly recap on my video on the colonial history of branding and commodity racism, the commodity racism epidemic was essentially designed to perpetuate racist colonial narratives using household branded goods like soap and detergent through advertising campaigns, which painted the West as being superior to their so-called East inferior counterparts. Essentially, they were able to use things like soap and the idea of washing the dirty, barbaric darkness of the East away, and to become closer to the purity of white Western Enlightenment. Now, this was during a time of colonial expansion following the end of the transatlantic slave trade. So essentially, commodity racism and its narratives really helped the West to justify and transition into a new form of colonialism after the old form had essentially died. If you haven't yet watched that video, you definitely should. Now, the birth of international development follows a pretty similar storyline. Between the 1920s and the 1930s, the Great Depression hit the West. Then there was the rise of the Nazi regime, the Second World War, and of course the Holocaust, followed by the beginnings of the Cold War. Now, for reasons I will leave to you to ponder, it seems that the genocide of indigenous American people and the enslavement of Africans in order to build the Western economy wasn't quite enough to have the rest of the world start to question the West's self-appointed position as the beacon of economic growth, morality, and enlightenment. But now, with all of these issues like the Holocaust and the war and the Great Depression suddenly falling so heavily and at once on Western ground, that started to change. So essentially, these majority world, aka Eastern countries, started to question the legitimacy of colonial Western power, and they now felt empowered to fight for freedom and independence. And so essentially, this ideological shift took hold, and something interesting started to happen during the 1940s to the 1970s. Decolonization started to take place. These majority world or Eastern countries began to gain their freedom and independence. Now, can you guess what started to happen when this new independence and decolonization started to happen? The West decided to roll out international development initiatives. Yep, you heard that right. Now, this sort of reminds me of the narcissist and the toxic relationship where the other party wants to leave the toxic relationship, and then the narcissist starts to panic and starts to think about how it can put on a new mask and spin a new story and develop a new tactic to lure that person back into the toxic relationship so that they can regain control and power again. Now, in the context of a narcissist, they call it hoovering, but in this context of international development, we can call it recolonization or neocolonialism, which literally means new colonialism. Neo means new. So it really shouldn't be that surprising that there is so much academic and anecdotal evidence that suggests that international development was really created specifically to further Western interests and continue to exercise the control that used to happen through old forms of colonialism. Basically, they had to find a new disguise that looked a lot less violent and a little bit more diplomatic. Cue international development. Now, what is bizarre about this whole development is that it's not even as if the transition from hardcore colonialism to international development happened a significant amount of time after these countries decided to gain independence and start to decolonize, to at least try to make the shift seem a little bit more genuine and legit. They didn't even wait. They started to roll out international development during the period that these countries were fighting for their freedom and independence and decolonizing. So the question is, my friends, how much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? Okay, the question is, how can we decolonize a sector that was specifically designed for the sole purpose of continuing colonialism? Let's explore a few suggestions that are becoming more common within the sector. Suggestion number 1, we do away with international development altogether. We burn it down and we say hell no. We find new ways to do it. And perhaps a new decentralized, community-led sector will develop more strongly to fit its place. A sector that is completely separate from the powers that be, i.e. the World Bank, the IMF, and all of these different colonial powers. Suggestion 2 is that all forms of Western-led international development are reframed for what they should be: forms of reparative justice, aka reparations, and that subsequently these initiatives or these development initiatives and their associated marketing and comms would then work to restore the dignity of the people and places that have been harmed by the symbolic violence caused by the sector's dehumanizing language and imagery. One of the things we'll be doing in this module is exploring the feasibility of these options, the potential impact, and some examples. We'll also be exploring some tools, some concepts and provocations that will help you to explore some important questions, thoughts and ideas, no matter where it is that you are on your journey. See you there.